Everyone, Jocelyn here. I'm adding this in after we recorded the original episode. We actually had two companies that changed their terms of service recently to not allow adult content, which is something that we talk about in this episode. The rug can get pulled out from underneath you at any moment. And I don't want to say exactly what companies they are just because I'm still waiting to hear back from them. I've contacted both of them to confirm that the change in their terms of service applies to us. As with many legal things, the wording can be kind of vague. And so, we just want to make sure that it actually applies to us before we stop using those products. But it is a very frustrating example of censorship and restrictions that can pop up at any moment. Obviously, we always do our due diligence and read terms of service before we start using a product, but that doesn't mean that they can't change their terms of service at any time. So just another fun day in the life of an adult game developer, and even more proof that this topic is as relevant as ever and will continue to be relevant for the foreseeable future. So we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. We're thrilled to have you here for another episode as we tackle a pressing question that touches on the challenges we face in the adult visual novel industry. Now, let's get seedy.
In today's episode, we'll be addressing a question from our Patreon supporter, Callisto. Callisto asked, the Patreon policy changes were very drastic for a certain type of AVN. GOG and Steam block adult games for whole countries. Itch currently seems to be on its way to becoming a hostile environment for adult games. Music licensing is still often incompatible with adult content, and the situation with payment processors doesn't seem to be getting any better. Every time I read about things like this, I feel like the world is moving backward in time instead of forward. How do you deal with all those obstacles thrown in your way?
So one of the obstacles that I'm sure a lot of you have already heard about before with other game developers encountering issues is music licensing. There have been a few notable games where the music has been just completely ripped out of the game because licensing became an issue at some point. Thankfully for a lot of those games, music is back in, just different music that wasn't originally there to begin with. And the reason it seems to us is because a lot of the websites that host a lot of, artist songs and such, they don't necessarily want the music to be associated with anything pornographic or adult content related. And that's definitely an obstacle that a lot of adult game developers have to contend with. Another issue is, and this is really relevant for social media posts and Patreon especially, is finding a service that actually is willing to host adult content or not safe for work videos for trailers and, anything where you want to show anything like that to your fans and supporters. Specifically, we got banned from Vimeo for hosting some of our adult content game trailers on there. I guess it was a, fuck around and find out moment, and we fucked around and they found us and they banned us. And now we're kind of screwed because Vimeo is one of the premier platforms that works with Patreon as far as hosting video content. Another obstacle is YouTube channel strikes. So any kind of pornographic material or adult content related stuff on YouTube is going to encounter issues and you're going to get demonetized. So for example, people out there who make content like reviewing adult games, it's not a profitable business for them at all unless they've already built up like a Patreon page that is essentially sustaining them because they're not going to earn any YouTube income from that whatsoever.
Yeah, even we've gotten strikes for linking to our website in our YouTube description because it leads back to something with adult content.
It's kind of a shame because, as you would imagine, YouTube would be great for, sharing the content around and being like, hey, check this video out. But, there's not a lot of people that are incentivized to make those videos if they're not actually making money off of it. So it kind of suppresses the adult content, adult game industry, and maybe that's what YouTube wants because they want to be more family friendly. Another, couple platforms, it would be the Google Play Store and the Apple Store. For the most part, they don't really allow adult content other than stuff that might get a little steamy, like suggestive. Like maybe they'll put some mist or some clouds over the characters, and it's up to your imagination at that point. But there's certainly nothing where they're going to go and show you specifically in the illustrations or the images that you see that would make it pornographic or adult content. One that surprised me not too long ago is looking on Nintendo through the eShop, just seeing all the digital games that they have. I ended up coming upon a few like hentai puzzle games. I was like, what in the world? This is not the Nintendo that I remember growing up. And don't get me wrong, I know that they had some mature games that they essentially allowed to go on their brand. But this is a different level in my opinion. I'm not saying it's bad. It's just, it was kind of eye-opening to me. And then lastly, this is a blessing for any of the game developers that are out there today. Steam didn't really allow the adult games like they do today until 2018. So before that point, the only way that the developers could really make their income, the best source that I knew of at the time anyways, was Patreon.
Yeah, there's a lot of platforms that do not want to allow any adult content. It seems just because they don't want to be associated with it because it harms their reputation. There are platforms that are okay with having adult content, but in our experience, they often face a lot of pushback from the payment processors like Visa and MasterCard, these main companies that process the credit cards, and then some of the third-party or intermediary processors like PayPal or Payoneer. And I think I've definitely seen lots of discussion about these payment processors and how that their reasons for not wanting to deal with adult content are mostly like moral or, as Callisto said, that, it seems like we're moving backward in terms of social acceptance of adult content and things like that. And I believe that's certainly true, but I think it affects payment processors in a way that people may not expect. It's not necessarily that there's some executive at MasterCard who doesn't want to process adult content, through their credit card platform. My understanding is that it has a lot more to do with risk, which is that adult content is much more likely to deal with things like refunds and chargebacks and people claiming that the content was charged fraudulently on their credit card. So I think that makes payment processors much more wary about dealing with platforms that have adult content because they know there's going to be a higher rate of refunds and chargebacks and therefore customer service complaints. And as far as I understand, they sometimes will try to pass that cost on to the platform. And so it's in the platform's best interest to clean up their content to whatever extent the payment processor is comfortable with in order to mitigate risk and therefore lower the fees that they have to deal with. Although I know that, some of it can just be purely reputational and, payment processors or other banks just not wanting to deal with adult content because it is bad to have their brand associated with this. And from my understanding, that's what happened with OnlyFans is that they had trouble finding lenders that would lend them money because the lenders would cite that it was a reputational risk for them to deal with OnlyFans. So certainly there's no way to know exactly what the balance is there, how much of it is just purely financial risk and how much of it is actually reputational risk. But certainly there's both factors at play.
I just wanted to mention real quick, like with OnlyFans, when that went down, I thought it was so wild because in my mind, if they were going to stick with that decision, they were done. I thought that was the moment for Fansly. I'm sure the people at Fansly, like the executives, they're like, yes, they effed up. Now it's our turn to take over. And no surprise, OnlyFans reversed the decision. And yeah, we know why.
Yeah. And, I'm one of those people that always thinks about things in terms of like, where are the incentives and what's the simplest explanation for things? And if I'm OnlyFans, the only situation in which I'm banning adult content on my platform is when I'm under so much pressure that it would literally mean shutting down the business to continue to allow it. And therefore they were trying to find some, some way to continue to have their platform and to continue to have payment processors and that, a website that payment processors were willing to deal with, or lenders, it sounds like was actually the issue here, lending them money. I would assume that is very similar to what happened with Patreon, which is that Patreon had to go back and forth with the payment processors. I think it was PayPal in Patreon's case, in order to reach an agreement that everybody was comfortable with in order for the payment processor to continue processing payments and to feel comfortable with the level of risk that they were taking on. So, Callisto mentioned that in their question that Patreon changed their policy. I believe that happened in 2018. Or late 2017, 2018, 2019, somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Patreon really tightened up their policies around adult content. And again, our understanding is that this was mostly spurred on by the payment processors not wanting to deal with certain types of content. So Patreon became very strict about certain types of content. The ones that would probably not surprise you are things like bestiality and necrophilia, underage content and sexual violence, rape, things like that. But the one that obviously gets talked about the most because it's the one that affects the most games is their ban on incest. And then they went a step further and banned any type of stepcest, so stepmom, stepsister, as well as adoptive family situations. Basically, they knew that those were being used as a workaround for incest content, and so they banned those as well, and thus the proliferation of landlady, roommate games. My understanding is that this was not Patreon trying to push their morals onto creators, but that this was specifically something that the payment processors had an issue with. And in order for them to continue to work with the payment processors, they had to be really strict about these rules.
I will say though that in my experience, we've been around since before these Patreon changes, so we've kind of seen the ups and downs with it. We've ridden that wave and we've weathered the storm, and we came out okay. So I think that gives us a little bit more confidence than maybe newbie creators that it'll all just work itself out eventually when in these types of situations. But my understanding is that Patreon is pretty willing to work with creators as long as you're not, to be frank, just an asshole about it. They will typically tell you exactly what you need to do in order to get your page back into compliance and to get it reinstated. In my experience too, a lot of the things that creators get dinged for are not breaking those rules, but it's more like minor things like having some type of nude content that wasn't behind a paywall, or just little rule violations like that will sometimes get you in trouble. But like I said, my experience from hearing from other creators is that they're always willing to work with you as long as you're willing to work with them.
I did think it was funny the other day, if you remember, we got an email from Patreon and they said, we reviewed your page and you're good to go.
Yeah, it started with good news.
Yeah.
And we were like, was there bad news? Yeah, we had no idea that we were being looked at, but apparently Trust and Safety was looking at us and we passed that test. The part that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable is that we didn't know we were being looked at. But I mean, it's one of those things where, yeah, you're just kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. But we're pretty confident that, whatever happens, we try to diversify. So if one platform goes down, like if we specifically get kicked off a platform, we have other platforms to rely on. And if one platform just stops allowing adult content altogether, then at some point another platform will pop up to replace it. And so you just have to be able to weather that kind of in between time when things are kind of uncertain.
That being said, we both talked about Steam, and if Steam went down, that'd be kind of like the nail in the coffin, like us considering looking at other jobs because so much income and revenue comes from there.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that we decided before we even decided to do this full time. The only reason we decided to do it full time was because of Steam, because we did not see a viable business model without Steam. That said, I think if Steam banned all adult games, like I said, I'm of the mindset that eventually something else would pop up or some other platform would then gain a much bigger audience, because there is such a huge audience on Steam that plays these games. Eventually they would trickle into other places. What would be kind of a game ender for us is if we specifically got banned from Steam, right. Not like all games got banned from Steam. So they're kind of, two different situations there. So speaking of Steam, Steam has a lot of the same restrictions that Patreon does as far as things that you can imagine that payment processors would not be happy to deal with. Things like rape, glorified rape. In particular, there was a notable case of that a while back where a game with glorified rape caused a big media stink and Steam therefore banned it. And, they don't allow bestiality. They don't allow underage content. But in particular, they're pretty easygoing compared to Patreon when it comes to things like incest.
Another issue, and this is probably related to local laws and such, is that it seems like most of the platforms, if not all of them, one issue is like you can't have real people, imagery or videos of real people, pornographic material, etc. in your games. Another issue is that, there's certainly countries out there where pornographic material or adult games, adult content are just straight up illegal or banned, and the country itself will take measures to ensure that their citizens essentially can't play these games easily. Now, that being said, obviously there's a ton of people who are out there that know how to use VPNs and ways to kind of backdoor the system. That being said, it's certainly a challenge for people to get around. Another note is that, Steam, they're based out of Washington, and they have strict policies around underage content. And, we don't know definitively if this is 100% because of the state laws there, but it would be safe to assume so that they want to make sure that they follow them. They want to make sure no underage content, nothing that exploits children in any way. And if you do mess around with that, they will ban you straight up and they will not work with you like Patreon. Once you mess up with Steam, that's it. There's nothing else you can do. And then lastly, just some topical news. Just wanted to mention, as far as like lolicon, like fictional underage content, some countries it's just straight up illegal, even if it's fictional. A game developer in Australia recently learned that the hard way, and they're going to pay the price. Honestly, a lot of people think that they're going to serve quite a few years in prison. So yeah, they fucked around and found out. Yeah, they're going to pay the piper now.
Yeah, I think the reality with these platforms is that they're selling to a really wide international audience, and the laws can vary so much in different places. So it's really in the platform's best interest to kind of err on the side of caution. I think Steam is a great example of like, they just don't want to mess around with their state laws. And so they are extremely strict and there is no recourse and there is just no question about that. As far as games not being allowed in certain countries. I think Germany is a good example of, that the fact that the Steam doesn't sell adult games in Germany isn't because adult games are banned in Germany. It's because the age verification requirements are such that Steam doesn't want to deal with it. It's just easier for them to ban games in Germany than it is for them to comply with the age verification. One of the other things that we wanted to address in Callisto's question was their reference to itch becoming increasingly hostile to adult games. This is another kind of topical news story from this year. There was a lot of talk about, is itch banning adult games? And we've been following this since the very beginning. In fact, we know pretty well one of the developers who was dealing with this issue with itch all the way back to February. So I feel like we have a pretty good idea of what was going on as much as anybody can, because we know a lot of the people that were involved. And first of all, I just want to say that we absolutely love itch. Both of our games rank very highly on itch. Prince of Suburbia is consistently in the top 50. I think right now it's like 20, 30 something. And A Shot in the Dark is consistently in the top 100. I think it's like 54 right now. So our games sell very well on itch. We've never had any issues with itch. We think it's a great platform, and we're glad that they exist because they are kind of a bit of a safe haven for adult developers. However, we definitely understand too that there are some kind of concerns about what the future might be for adult games on itch. And it's hard to tell exactly what it is that itch wants to allow, what they want to do. They just haven't been as transparent about it as maybe Patreon and Steam have, as far as like what they definitely will allow, what they won't allow, and how they're going to deal with it. And they don't, at least from the example we saw this year, they don't seem very willing to work with developers as far as figuring out how to, comply with whatever it is that they want. Basically what happened this year is that itch changed the way that certain games were able to process payments. Instead of the payments being processed through itch and then a bulk payment going to the developer, which is a safer way for developers to handle their payments, because it's PayPal is very strict about adult content, and so having it go through itch and come through in one lump sum, makes it much more legitimate in PayPal's eyes than if the developer is processing each payment individually from every player, which is one of the options on itch, but is not ideal for anybody. And not just because of adult content being not allowed on PayPal, but also just because there's a lot of implications when it comes to paying sales tax and to paying taxes and VAT taxes, and there's just a whole bunch of things that you don't want to deal with as a developer. You just want itch to take all your money and then pay you what they owe you and, make everything easy for you, right? So when they took that option away from a handful of developers, for some developers, that was essentially a ban, in that they live in countries where they're not allowed to use PayPal or Payoneer, which are the only two ways that you can process payments with itch. And so for them, it was essentially not a ban, but it prohibited them from selling their game on itch, even if they could have a store page on itch. And then for some developers, it was just inconvenient and or put them at risk of, losing their PayPal account if they were caught processing payments for these games. So it wasn't truly a ban, but it certainly made even us nervous, right? Because itch wasn't very clear about what exactly were the criteria for the games that got changed in terms of their payment method. And there were a handful that got banned. Although the handful that got banned, it seemed pretty clear that they had content that could be considered illegal. But amongst the 20 or so developers that we know of that their payment method was changed, there really was no rhyme or reason. There was no pattern that you could really identify as to like, oh, well, this is why it's changed it. Their statement about it was also very vague. Their statement was, "This decision was made after considering various factors related to your account, including nature of content, risk, disputes, and the resources required by our team to review payments associated with your account. To provide uninterrupted service to as many users as possible, we can no longer facilitate payments for your account through our payout system." So in my opinion, it seems pretty clear that there was some type of financial thing going on with this. Either it was no longer financially beneficial for them to be processing payments for these creators. Some of that may be related to the fact that with itch, you can set your own revenue share. So you can set your revenue share to 0, and therefore itch gets 0 share of the revenue that you collect on the platform. That seemed to be a common theme amongst many of the developers, although not all of them had their rev share set to 0. Some of them had it much higher. They talk about content and risk and disputes. So again, it could be that they're dealing with a lot of chargebacks and, fraudulent claims. That made us a little bit nervous because we've had quite a few claims of Prince of Suburbia being a fraudulent transaction, which again, you kind of roll your eyes at it because you're like, nobody stole your credit card and then bought both of our games with your credit card. Like, I'm sorry, that just did not happen. But, that's how people get their refunds when they feel like they have no other recourse. So yeah, with itch in general, whether or not itch is becoming more hostile to adult games really remains to be seen. Their own documentation is very unclear about what they allow. They aren't even really clear on whether they allow adult games. They've even been known to say that if it's not allowed on PayPal, then it's not allowed on their platform. However, the games that are actually on their platform don't match up with that. So yeah, Itch is one of those situations where, again, we love Itch. We've had a great experience on there. If you look at Itch, it definitely appears to be a safe haven for adult games. However, it's definitely concerning that they seem to be changing policies sometimes in the background without a lot of explanation as to why. And you can't really get a straight answer about what the future of your own game might be on the platform. And of course, too, it goes without saying that this whole legal issue with the developer in Australia, their Itch page has been involved in that. And so this may have been going on for this entire year. And that's part of it. So we just don't really know. And unfortunately, Itch hasn't been very transparent about it. But yeah, certainly it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in developers when they're just not sure what's going to happen.
Right. As you're saying, Itch was very vague when they were talking to all those adult game developers. And then, I did find it interesting, as you were saying, that a part of it for sure, if not all of it, was financially related. And it was interesting when it was said that, if you change your revenue share after the moment that you receive that kind of email where your payment system's getting taken out, it's not going to change anything. So it's almost like, was that supposed to happen, or is that going to happen because you didn't have the revenue share before and they're upset with you and like you kind of went against the grain?
Yeah, it seemed clear to me in the interactions that developers were having with the founder of Itch that it seems like Itch is very concerned with being a very accessible platform for indie developers. And so Itch definitely does not want to, and the founder even said in so many words that they never want to have a required revenue share. They want developers to be able to leave it at zero. So yeah, it's hard to say if maybe there's just some developers where if they set it at zero, it's just simply not worth it to Itch to have them on the platform. But rather than set a minimum that would then apply to everybody, it was easier for them to just remove a handful. And I think what's really important to note here is that we only know about 20 developers that this happened to, which would probably suggest that there's maybe, at most between like 50 to 100 at most that were affected by this. It could be as little as 20 or 30, right? I'm assuming that Itch assumed that if they just quietly change the payment method for, 20 to 100 developers out of thousands of developers on Itch, that, they might have to deal with some complaints from those individual developers, but that nobody was really going to notice on a grand scale. And I think, again, it's a fuck around and find out moment. I think what Itch did not anticipate is how extremely tight knit the adult game dev industry is and how much we all talk behind the scenes, because we have to be really tight knit and we have to stand together in situations like this where, if something happens to another developer, it's only a matter of time before it happens to us. And so we all stand in solidarity and we're always talking about these things so that other people can be warned and potentially, not make the same mistakes. And, it reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend about how, gossip is really something that's subversive. It's the way that like revolutionary movements are built. This, talking behind the scenes where the powers that be aren't looking, that is definitely happening with adult game developers. And I don't think that Itch had any idea the amount of outcry that they were going to get from so many developers that were scared that the same thing might happen to them when they just, did this to a really small handful.
Yeah, it was very clear that they were not prepared for this kind of uproar, for sure.
Yeah. So, getting back to the question at hand, which is how do you deal with all of this? That is definitely one way that we as an industry deal with it, is that we are very tight knit behind the scenes. Everybody talks to everybody. Everybody knows everybody. There's lots of places that we can gather in relative privacy in order to discuss things like this. And so while it may not necessarily sway a platform because we are probably a very small amount of their revenue overall, we at least do stand together when something happens to one developer. Other people will come out in defense of them and press the platform for more transparency and to find out more information so that at least, if what happened to those developers is, not something that can be fixed, at least it can be avoided for future developers. So that's something that this industry is really good about. So I think in general, I see, adult content as kind of a high risk, high reward industry. I don't know if you feel the same way that, it's kind of you are kind of always waiting for the other shoe to drop. However, it's a really underserved market because of that, because it is kind of hard to get into and there's lots of risks and the rug can kind of be pulled out from you at any moment. And so you have to kind of have a backup plan. You have to have a certain amount of security if you're going to count on this as your full-time job. So in that sense, it's high risk. But if you can weather the storm, I feel like it's a very rewarding industry to be in.
Right. Personally, I always advocate for people to always have a backup plan. If you don't have a backup plan, you're wrong, in my opinion. And along with that, and with what Jocelyn was saying, It's very risky, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to sell your games the very next day, because the policies and legislation can change overnight, and then you're just completely screwed. So, make sure you always have a backup plan, have some money saved, socked away, as some people say, and, be ready for the day, if it does come, where you can no longer make these games to actually make your living.
For sure. Thank you, Callisto, for your insightful question and for addressing such an important topic that affects all adult content creators. Certainly, we are not alone in this as adult game developers. All adult content creators have to deal with these same types of restrictions and censorship and obstacles. So, it's something that we are definitely very excited to shed some light on and to hopefully build more awareness around the obstacles that adult content creators face.
If you have more questions or topics you'd like us to explore, please reach out. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.